Friends, today I want to talk about a book that I first encountered more than 4 decades ago. I have a vague recollection of having read it. I know I did read it then. And it stayed with me for some time. And then, as happens quite often, other things came along, encountered other books. But in some fashion or the other, this book kind of lingered on. And I finally returned to it some days ago. I returned to it some days ago, thinking about the hunger and starvation that have now become a part of the daily life of something like 2 million people in Gaza. But this is not a book about Gaza. It's not a book about the conflict. And it's not about that kind of hunger, which is a hunger that has afflicted that many people owing to the politics of that region, the politics of one particular state, the state of Israel, and of course, the ongoing conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. But my mind has also been taken to this book that I want to talk about today, because very recently I was at a conference in Switzerland where I spoke about the politics of hunger striking and fasting. And that's another long subject, distinguishing between what Gandhi had done and what some other hunger strikers had done. Although Gandhi, of course, never called himself a hunger striker, and he never claimed to have gone on a hunger strike. He distinguished between the fast and the hunger strike. But both what's happening in Gaza and my recent work on fasting, they both have a bearing in a very different kind of way on the book that I do want to talk about today. And the book is called Hunger. It's the name of a novel. Whether it should be called a novel is still a very interesting question. And it's by a writer who's really such a gifted writer and enormously talented, and someone who has largely gone into obscurity. So this is a book in the Oxford World Classics. The book Hunger is by Knut Hamsun, a Norwegian writer. And one of the reasons the book has gone into obscurity is because of the politics of the writer. And I want to begin with that. This is typically not how I begin my book talks, because I try to launch into the book and don't say much about the author. But in this case, I will, because it's a very good illustration of what happens when we allow our reading choices to be dictated by a certain kind of, let me use that banal phrase, political correctness, right? Now, in order to get a clue as to what I mean before I get into his biography, think about the music of Richard Wagner, which, as we know, was greatly admired by Hitler and by the Nazis more widely. And I certainly have come across people, not very many, but have come across a few, who said that they wouldn't listen to the music of Wagner because Wagner was anti-Semitic and he was a favorite of the Nazis and of Hitler. And of course, the question is not whether music is apolitical, because I'm making no such claim, unlike many people who will. I think many people will say that instrumental music in particular is apolitical. Well, that again is another long subject for a talk, but that's not my claim over here. My claim simply is that what does it mean to enjoy a piece of music such as The Ring by Wagner? And there is no question that Wagner was an enormously gifted composer. The music is mesmerizing. Now, this is one of the issues that has arisen when we think about Knut Hamsun's book, Hunger. So Hamsun was born in 1859, and he's born into really a working class family. He has a myriad jobs in his first 10, 15 years as a young man, as an adult. He works as a shop assistant, as a teaching assistant, a deputy to a local policeman. And at the age of 13, he gets on a ship and he goes to America, where he lived for 2 years. Then he returned back to Europe and went back to the United States and lived there for another 2 years, from 1886 to 1888. And in these stints in the United States, he worked on a farm as a farm laborer. He also worked on a tram as a tram conductor. But his main ambition in life was to be a writer, and he became a mighty fine writer, admired at the height of his powers, and much later on, long after his death, by the likes of people like Henry Miller, right? So what happened to Knut Hamsun? This is one of his books, Hunger, in the Oxford World Classics, with a new translation by Terence Cave. The book for which he's most well known, I think, is Growth of the Soil, a later novel, a substantially later novel, and a novel which, in a sense, had a kind of an agrarian vision, a kind of an agrarian utopian vision of what a good society might be. He won the Nobel Prize, Hamsun, for literature in 1920. He's one of many Nobel Prize winners of literature that no one has heard of today. And in the 1930s, he becomes a supporter of the Nazis. He even meets with Hitler in Bavaria in June 1943. And Goebbels went so far as to actually get Hamsun a medal. When Hitler died, Hamsun wrote a glowing obituary of Hitler on 7th May 1945. We know, of course, that Hitler committed suicide, the Germans lost the war, and Hamsun was interned, put in prison for a very short period of time for being a collaborationist, for having aided and abetted morally the Nazis. But he's eventually released, and he's going to die some years after his release. His case also reminds me of the poet Ezra Pound, who, as some of you might know, was also a supporter of the Nazis and was, in fact, actually committed to one of the major psychiatric institutions in the United States in Washington, D.C. But let me now turn to the novel very briefly. This is a novel. Hamsun had some reservations about calling it a novel. He liked to call it a collection of 4 fragments, 4 sections, as it were. And it doesn't have much of a plot. The book is about the experience of hunger that a writer has. A writer who walks around the streets of Christiania, a city in Norway, walks around the streets day after day. Hunger is gnawing at him. He hasn't eaten for days. He has hallucinations. He has visions. He walks by a shop, which is a bakery. He sees cakes, and he begins to hallucinate. And once in a rare while, he gets a few kroner, right? He gets a few coins, and he then splurges, or he does something eccentric. That's what the book is about. Simply that. There's a woman he runs into, he gives a name to her. He gives strange names to people, including to himself. But if you're looking for incidents, if you're looking for events, if you're looking for action, if you're looking for dialogue, it's not very much. There is some, but it's mainly a dialogue with himself. It's a novel about interiority. How did Hamsun himself describe what he was writing about? He said once that there were lots of people writing novels, but there were not enough people writing about hunger. And he said, my book is an attempt to portray the special, distinctive life of the mind, the mystery of nerves in a famished body, right? To portray the special, distinctive life of the mind. Now, he doesn't mean life of the mind in the sense in which Hannah Arendt, one of the great social theorists and political philosophers of the 20th century, meant when she wrote her book, right, called The Life of the Mind. Because there, what she was talking about, what does it mean for a person to engage with a certain intellectual tradition, right? And to be immersed in that tradition and to think about how we might use our faculty of reason to have a vision of the world, to order society, to try to resolve problems. What does it mean to live a life largely in the mind, a life of the mind, right? To philosophize. Now, this is not what Hamsun means by an attempt to portray the special, distinctive life of the mind. What he's trying to create is he's trying to create a topography of hallucinations. That's what the book is about. The book is about the topography of hallucinations, thoughts, desires, visions of a man living on no food or very little food, who's constantly thinking about food and should therefore feel that he's a pauper, and yet somehow he has these grandiose ideas that he's far superior to other people, right? That's what this book does. It's an amazing journey. It requires some amount of dedication to read this book because people are used to plots, to stories, to characters, to multiple characters, right? And we know that our idea of the novel has been shaped. So let's just confining ourselves to the novel in the English language from England itself without even getting into what happened to the Indian novel in English in India and Kenya, you know, under, let's say, someone like Ngugi. I mean, Ngugi, of course, wrote in Kikyu as well, but he wrote in English as also, or what happened, obviously, to the novel in English in the United States, right? In England itself, think about the novelists that most of you would know. Might be Charles Dickens, it might be most famously perhaps Jane Austen, right? William Makepeace Thackeray, George Orwell, Somerset Maugham, Graham Greene, Julian Barnes, right? That's what comes to mind, right? Many other names, of course. Trollope, for many people, he's got such a huge fan club, right? But this is a book which therefore is also actually tampering with the novel form. It is a novel. It's a novel because you have a character. You have a character, and it is a novel, a book about an exploration about his sensibility, about his odyssey, his journey. So this is on a much smaller scale. You know, if you read Ulysses by James Joyce, right, which is basically Bloom going around Dublin right? Hundreds of pages, one of the masterpieces of world literature. You can think about the flaneur, but Hamsun's character is not really a flaneur. He's not really a flaneur. He's not really a dandy, the man about town, right? With a nice hat, coattails, and a walking stick, which is what you would expect in the late 19th century. No, I mean, he's a man who basically has to pawn the only waistcoat he has, and in fact, at one point, he removes all the buttons from one of the few undershirts he has left in the hope that he can pawn the buttons and get one coin so that he can have a meal, right? So he's not really a dandy, he's not really a flaneur, but he does go around town. And actually, the book gives you a very good sense of the topography of the town. But this book is a book about the psychology of hunger, the Odyssey of hunger, the pathology of hunger, the ecology of hunger, the politics of hunger, the aesthetics of hunger, right? It has no political, ethical message in any sense of the term, right? And Hamsun said what he wanted to do was he wanted to make people listen to the sound of the soul's mimosas drawing breath, right? Soul's mimosas drawing breath. And what kind of therefore sentences does one get? So let me just give you some sense of how this feeling of hunger awakens within him and how he thinks about it, right? So first fragment, first 3 lines. It was at the time when I was wandering around Hungary in Christiania, that strange city no one leaves before it has set its mark on them. I lie awake in my garret and hear a clock somewhere beneath me striking 6, right? And then I skip some lines. As soon as I opened my eyes, I began from long established habit to reflect on whether I had anything to look forward to today. Things had been a bit tight for me lately. One of my possessions after the other had been taken to uncle. I'd become nervous and irritable. A couple of times I'd even spent the day in bed with a dizzy spell. Now and then, when luck was on my side, I could manage to get 5 kroner out of some newspaper or other for a literary piece, right? And so, he goes on for a couple of pages, and then this landlady will say, I want you to vacate the place because you haven't paid the rent for a long period of time. And so he goes wandering around the streets, walking from one place to another with nothing specific in mind, no motive. Right? That's what I mean. There's no plot in that sense. He doesn't have a destination to reach. And he sees that when he is walking, and this is all in the first 2 pages, that he's being followed by a cripple. And then this cripple is in front of him, right? And he gets irritated. So he says, I felt that little by little that's the cripple, was both ruining my light mood and dragging the beautiful unsullied morning down with him, making it hideous. Now remember what he has said in the beginning, right? That this is just another day. He's wondering, what am I going to do this day? Recall, right, what he had said? That he had woken up feeling hungry, right? He had woken up thinking, is this going to be just another day? And now, why then is he saying that I felt that little by little this cripple was both ruining my light mood and dragging the beautiful unsullied morning down with him, making it hideous, right? So this is where he's now imagining, that look, I'm actually just fine, and now this cripple has come along and he's spoiling it all for me. He looked like a big lumping insect. Think of Kafka's Metamorphosis, right? Remember, right? Man wakes up and imagine that he's been transformed into a huge insect. Yeah, he looked like a big lumping insect which was trying by sheer force to fight its way to a place in the world and reserve its right to keep the pavement for its own exclusive use. Kafka, by the way, also wrote a book called The Hunger Artist, which is a fascinating book about a man who would stage hunger, stage a hunger strike. He would place himself, in a cage in a public arena, and then, he was an artist. This is well before the idea of performance art, as we think of it now for the last few decades, really came along. Yeah. And one of the interesting things, as I said, is that this character, who at one point calls himself Andreas Tangen, that's not really his name, he just gives himself that name. And it's a very interesting episode there where he gives himself that name because he's been wandering around, and he's been standing in one place, and he gets, in a way, he has an encounter with a policeman. So this is in pages 46 to 48, right? And since he's been drifting around, the policeman starts to get a little suspicious. And he's picked up and he's taken to the jail, right? He's a vagrant. So he's basically, in a way, violated some kind of vagrancy act. And then the policeman says, "Oh, so what are you doing out on the streets?" And he says, "Oh, I'm a journalist. I'm a journalist." And yes, indeed, that's how he makes his living, to the extent that he makes any living, because he has these grand ambitions. So if you go back into the novel, back to the very early pages, around page 8, 9, there's an incident where he talks about how he has this grand plan to write something, and then he finds out that he doesn't even have any pencil on him, right? So let me go back to that passage, and then I'll go to the episode with the policeman, right? So he says here, "I felt myself capable of a greater labor. I was in the mood to overcome difficulties and decided to embark on a dissertation in 3 parts on philosophical theory of intuition. Naturally, that would give me the opportunity to pulverize a few of Kant's sophisms." So this is clearly a very educated uh, uh, writer, hunger artist. "I was just going to take out my writing things and get to work when I discovered that I no longer had a pencil on me. I'd left it behind at the pawnbroker's. My pencil was in the waistcoat pocket." So he had just one stub. It was in the waistcoat pocket, and he had pawned that coat. So now he no longer had a pencil with which he could write, which was the sole means of survival that he had, right? So he has all these grandiose plans. He's going to write something, which is going to be a philosophical theory of intuition, and he's going to cannibalize some of Kant's ideas, perhaps, and all of that, right? So he can claim to be a writer, a journalist. So when he gets picked up, he's taken to the police station, and then he's asked what's his profession. He says, "I'm a journalist," and says your name, and he makes up a name. And then he pretends that, "Oh, I've been out all night and I've had one too many to drink, and I can't find my keys, and that's why I'm wandering around." And so he makes up this whole cock and bull story, and the following morning they release him, but to his disadvantage, because he's not like the others who have been taken in, ordinary people who've been taken in for petty crimes, who get breakfast. This man is just let go of without any food, and all he really wants is food. So it's it's that kind of book, which really is, as I said, a wonderful exploration. There is a of interiority, of what might be described the states of mind of a person, how he thinks poverty has sometimes sharpened his faculties, and then he makes very interesting pronouncements, such as the fact that he thinks that the intelligent pauper is a much finer observer than the intelligent rich man. And he's probably quite right about that, right? But he feels all the time vastly superior to others. And here I'll give you one little illustration of that. And with that, I will more or less conclude my brief discussion of this book, right? So here it is. This is page 76, 77. And he says, so he's been, walking through the streets and all of that. Why the hell? Why the flaming, living, everlasting hell was there never an end to my trials and tribulations? With long, furious steps, with my coat collar turned brutally up on my neck and my hands clenched in my trouser pockets, I strode along, cursing my unlucky stars the whole way. Never a truly carefree hour in 7, 8 months. No food that would keep me alive, even for the space of a short week, before want brought me to my knees again. And now, on top of everything, I'd gone and acted honorably in the midst of all the misery. Ha ha, honorably to the very core, right? So this is an illustration. This is, this follows a discussion where somehow he had gotten 10 crore, and then he has 1 million, and then he gives the rest away, right? Okay. And now, on top of everything, I'd gone and acted honorably in the midst of all the misery. Ha ha, honorably to the very core. Christ almighty, what an utter fool I'd been. And I began to tell myself how I'd even gone and had a bad conscience because I'd once taken Hans Pauli's blanket to the pawnbroker. I sneered at my sensitive moral principles, spat scornfully on the pavement, and could find no words harsh enough to ridicule myself for my stupidity. If only it had been now. If only it had been now. If I found on the street now a shilling saved by some schoolgirl, a poor widow's last remaining ore is 100 ores makes up 1 kroner, right? So it would be like a paisa, 100 paisa making up 1 rupee. I pick it up and stick it in my pocket, steal it with thorough premeditation, and sleep as sound as a log the whole night afterwards. So he's now reprimanding himself for having been moralistic and all of that. I walked 3-4 times around the palace, then made up my mind to return home, right? It was about 11 o'clock. I've just skipped a little bit here. The street was quite dark and people were strolling around just about everywhere. White couples and noisy clusters jostling together. The crucial hour had struck, the coupling time when secret deals are made and happy adventures begin. The rustling of girls' skirts, brief outbreaks of sensuous laughter, swelling breasts, heavy gasps of breath. A long way down by the Grand Hotel, a voice calling, "Emma!" The whole street was a swamp from which hot vapors drifted up, right? So, here he's talking about, this is what these young men and women are going to do, right? The whole street was a swamp. Yeah. To comfort myself and regard myself as innocent, I began to unearth all kinds of faults in these happy people who glided past me. I shrugged my shoulders angrily and looked at them contemptuously as they went by, couple after couple. These tedious, sweet-sucking students who imagined themselves to be letting rip in European style if they managed to put their hand on a sewing girl's breast. Right? So, you know, here he is mocking them, right? This is bourgeois society, these couples who are feeling so happy and romantic. And here I am with my lofty sentiments, and I know Kant, you know, and yet I'm starving. So this novel plays around with this man's, it's an exploration of this man's mixed feelings, right? The anger, the desire that he feels, the sentiments he has when he sees others who are well fed and well clothed, but also others who are much like himself. Right? It's a book to be cherished. Thank you.